ChatGPT said. The neighborhood had looked like something straight out of a real estate magazine when I first drove through it. Perfectly manicured lawns lined both sides of the winding street, each house painted in warm, welcoming tones. There were flower beds overflowing with tulips and hydrangeas, children riding their bikes under the watchful eyes of parents sipping coffee on their porches. The realtor had smiled knowingly, pointing out how safe and community-focused the area was. The words "Homeowners Association" had been mentioned in passing, framed as a safeguard to keep the place looking beautiful. I had nodded, not giving it much thought. After all, I took care of my home. I followed rules. Why would that be a problem? The first couple of weeks were bliss. I moved in, unpacked, and started meeting the neighbors. Most of them were polite, if a little reserved, but there was one woman who seemed to be everywhere, Karen. I first met her on the day I was planting roses in my front yard. She strode up the driveway like she owned the place, clipboard in hand, wearing a bright pink visor that clashed horribly with her floral blouse. Without even introducing herself, she started explaining how my choice of rose color might not be in harmony with the neighborhood aesthetic. I laughed politely, thinking she was just overly friendly, maybe even helpful. I didn't realize she was the self-appointed sheriff of the HOA, a woman whose authority was matched only by her eagerness to wield it. Over the next few days, I noticed her more and more. She'd walk her small white dog past my house at least 4 times a day, always pausing just long enough to glance over my property. Sometimes, I'd catch her taking photos with her phone. At first, I brushed it off, maybe she was just proud of the neighborhood and documenting it for the HOA. But then, little notes started appearing in my mailbox. They weren't friendly. Your trash bins are visible from the street. Violation number 14. Mailbox paint is slightly chipped, please address immediately. Front lawn grass appears to exceed 3 inches in height. Violation number 7. It was absurd. I'd lived in places before with rules, but nothing this obsessive. I complied where I could, moved the bins, repainted the mailbox, mowed the lawn twice in 1 week just to be safe. But the more I followed the rules, the more violations she seemed to find. It was as if she had a personal stake in making my life difficult. One Saturday morning, I was on my porch with a cup of coffee when Karen came marching up again. This time, she didn't bother with fake pleasantries. We need to talk about the shade of your shutters, she said, her tone sharp. It's close to the approved color, but not exact. You'll need to repaint them within 30 days. I stared at her, incredulous. The shutters were a tasteful navy blue, almost identical to my neighbor's. But she insisted she had the official color chart and that mine were a few shades off. I started to notice the way other neighbors avoided her. If she was walking down the street, people would duck inside their homes or suddenly become very busy watering plants. It was like she had the entire street under quiet siege, and no one dared to stand up to her. That was the first time I felt the creeping sense that this place, the place I'd thought was perfect, was going to be a nightmare. The HOA wasn't just about keeping things pretty. With Karen at the helm, it was about control. And she'd already decided I was going to be her next project. I just didn't know yet how far she was willing to go. It started small enough, the kind of petty annoyances you might laugh about with friends over dinner. But in our neighborhood, every little infraction seemed to carry the weight of a federal offense when Karen was involved. At first, I tried to shrug it off. I told myself she was just one of those people who needed a hobby and had chosen neighborhood surveillance as hers. But that illusion quickly burned away when her behavior shifted from passive-aggressive notes to something far more personal. The first escalation came in the form of an official-looking letter slipped under my door, not mailed, not stamped, just delivered by hand. It accused me of violating HOA Section 3, subsection B, for clutter visible in the side yard. The so-called clutter was a covered barbecue grill and a folded lawn chair leaning against the fence. I knew for a fact my neighbor 2 houses down had an entire stack of rusting bicycles in plain sight, yet somehow that wasn't an issue. No, it was only my unsightly storage that seemed to warrant immediate correction. Then came the fines. At first, it was a $50 fee for leaving my garbage cans out a few hours past collection day. A week later, another $75 for failing to maintain consistent paint coverage on exterior structures. That one made me laugh bitterly. Karen had walked up my driveway, run her finger along the side of my garage, and declared that the sun fading on the paint counted as a violation. I appealed both fines through the official HOA email, but my requests seemed to vanish into a void. It wasn't until later that I learned Karen was not only head of the HOA's compliance committee but also handled all email complaints. Her campaign wasn't limited to paperwork. She began showing up at odd hours, sometimes knocking on my door just to remind me of upcoming HOA inspections or neighborhood cleanup days that I was expected to attend. I'd see her peering into my backyard from the sidewalk, or slowly cruising by in her SUV, eyes scanning like a hawk searching for prey. On one occasion, I returned home to find her in my driveway, measuring the distance between my hedges and the sidewalk. When I confronted her, she smiled like I was overreacting and told me she was just ensuring everything was in compliance. The worst part was the way she tried to turn the neighborhood against me. I started getting cold stares from people I'd once chatted with over the fence. Conversations would end abruptly when I approached. I overheard whispers, things about how I was making trouble and bringing down the neighborhood's value. It didn't take much to guess where these rumors had started. Karen had a way of sprinkling poison into every interaction, dropping just enough concern to make herself sound reasonable while painting me as some rebellious outsider. I decided I needed to protect myself. I began documenting everything, dates, times, photos, and even short videos whenever I caught her snooping around. My friends thought I was overdoing it, but I had a gnawing sense that this wasn't going to stop on its own. Karen wasn't the type to simply get bored and move on. If anything, my resistance seemed to fuel her obsession. The breaking point came late one Thursday evening. I was on my couch watching TV when I heard a loud banging on my front door. I opened it to find Karen standing there, clipboard in hand, demanding that I immediately address the fact that my porch light bulb was out. "It's a safety hazard," she said in a tone that suggested I was moments away from causing a neighborhood catastrophe. I told her I'd replace it in the morning, but she insisted on standing there, arms crossed, until I went inside and did it right then. It was clear now, this wasn't about rules anymore. It was personal. And somewhere in Karen's mind, she'd declared war on me. ChatGPT said. The night it happened began like any other, quiet, calm, and utterly ordinary. I had finished dinner, washed the dishes, and settled into the couch with a book. Outside, the neighborhood was still, the only sounds the distant hum of crickets and the occasional car passing on the main road beyond our cul-de-sac. My phone buzzed with a weather alert, dry conditions, no rain in sight, but it barely registered. I had no idea those conditions would soon become the perfect fuel for disaster. It was a little past midnight when I woke up to the smell of smoke. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a phantom scent drifting in from somewhere far away. But within seconds, my eyes started to sting, and I heard it, a faint crackling, like the sound of paper tearing slowly, only louder and deeper. My heart lurched. I jumped out of bed and moved toward the hallway, only to see an orange glow flickering through the front windows. When I opened the front door, a wave of heat hit me so hard it stole my breath. My porch was on fire. Flames danced up the wooden posts, licking at the overhang, feeding greedily on the dry air. Somewhere to my left, glass shattered, a window giving way under the pressure of the heat. Instinct took over. I ran back inside, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911, my voice shaky as I shouted my address. The next moments blurred into chaos. I raced to the back of the house, slipping my shoes on and grabbing the small box of important documents I kept in my bedroom. The smoke was thicker now, black and swirling, filling my lungs with each desperate breath. My eyes watered so badly I could barely see the door handle. I stumbled out into the backyard, coughing violently, my chest burning. By the time I made it to the street, neighbors were spilling out of their homes, some in pajamas, others barefoot, all staring in shock. A few grabbed garden hoses, spraying water in a futile attempt to slow the fire's spread. Someone shouted my name and pulled me toward the curb just as the first fire engine rounded the corner. The sirens, the flashing lights, the rush of firefighters leaping into action, it all felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unravel. As the crew fought the flames, I stood there, shivering despite the heat radiating from what was once my home. That's when I noticed something odd. One of my neighbors, an older man named Greg, was whispering urgently to a firefighter, pointing toward the street. Later, he told me what he had seen, a lone figure walking briskly away from my house just before the fire started. Short, blonde hair. Pink visor. Even in the dim streetlight, he was sure it was Karen. The firefighters worked for nearly 2 hours, but it was no use. The house was gone, charred beams, blackened walls, and the faint hiss of steam as water met smoldering wood. When the flames were finally out, one of the investigators approached me. His face was grim as he explained that there were signs of accelerant near the porch steps. Gasoline. This wasn't an accident. It was arson. As I sat on the curb, wrapped in a blanket someone had handed me, my mind went numb. My home, my belongings, the life I'd built in this neighborhood, all of it reduced to ash. And somewhere out there, the person responsible was probably sleeping soundly, satisfied. But deep down, I already knew. This wasn't random. This was personal. And all the signs pointed to the one person who had been making my life hell from the moment I moved in. Karen. The morning after the fire, I woke to the sound of engines rumbling outside. 2 fire department vehicles and an unmarked police car were parked on the street in front of what used to be my home. The smell of wet ash lingered in the air, clinging to my clothes, my hair, even the inside of my mouth. I stood on the sidewalk, staring at the wreckage, still half convinced I might wake up and find it was just a nightmare. But reality was blackened timber, twisted metal, and the occasional wisp of smoke curling into the morning sky. A man in a dark jacket approached, introducing himself as Detective Miller. He spoke in the calm, deliberate tone of someone who has delivered bad news too many times. The fire marshal confirmed what we suspected, he said. This wasn't accidental. We found traces of gasoline on your porch and along the side of the house. Whoever did this wanted it to spread fast. His words settled over me like lead. I had already known, deep down. But hearing it out loud made my stomach turn. I told him about the history with Karen, the notes, the fines, the constant surveillance. I mentioned the witness, Greg, and his account of seeing her walking away from my property moments before the flames erupted. Miller took notes, his pen scratching steadily, his eyes flicking up every so often to gauge my expression. He didn't make promises, but he assured me they would look into every lead. That afternoon, Greg agreed to give an official statement. He described the pink visor, the brisk pace, the way Karen had turned her head slightly when she saw him, as if startled to be noticed. Another neighbor, a young woman named Leah, came forward too. She told the police she had heard someone walking quickly past her house around midnight, heels clicking against the pavement, and then caught the faint, sharp scent of gasoline. The detectives requested security footage from homes in the surrounding streets. Most cameras were motion activated and didn't catch much in the darkness, but one grainy clip from a house 3 doors down showed a figure matching Karen's build approaching my property at 12:02 a.m. and leaving just a few minutes later. The face wasn't clear, but the outline of the visor was unmistakable. As the evidence piled up, Karen's facade began to crack. When questioned, she claimed she had been home all night watching television, but she couldn't provide anyone to confirm her alibi. Her story wavered under repeated questioning. First she said she hadn't left her house after 8 p.m., then later admitted she had taken her dog for a late walk, but insisted it was nowhere near my street. Meanwhile, I began working with an attorney. Losing my home had been devastating, but the thought of her walking away unpunished lit a fire in me almost as fierce as the one she had started. We compiled every HOA letter she had sent me, every violation notice, every photograph I had taken of her snooping on my property. The harassment pattern was clear, and now it was linked to something much darker. The weeks leading up to the court date were grueling. I was staying with a friend across town, living out of a suitcase, making endless trips to meet with investigators and lawyers. Each time I saw the charred remains of my home, I felt the same mix of rage and disbelief. But alongside that, there was a growing determination. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting to make sure no one else in that neighborhood, or anywhere, would ever have to deal with a Karen like her again. When the charges were officially filed, arson, criminal mischief, and harassment, I knew the real confrontation was coming. And it would take place under the harsh lights of a courtroom, with Karen sitting just a few feet away. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, a mix that somehow made the air feel heavier. I sat at the plaintiff's table with my attorney, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to keep them from trembling. Across the room, Karen sat with her lawyer, wearing a muted beige suit instead of her usual bright colors. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and the infamous pink visor was gone. But even without it, her expression carried the same smugness I'd come to know all too well, like this was just another HOA meeting where she'd get the final word. When the judge entered, the room fell silent except for the shuffle of feet as everyone stood. My heart thudded in my chest as the proceedings began. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the timeline of events, the years of harassment, the string of petty violations, the witness accounts placing her near my home that night, and, most damning, the security footage showing her distinctive visor moving toward and away from my property minutes before the fire. Greg took the stand first. He spoke clearly, his voice steady, as he described seeing Karen walking away from my house, her pace quick, her head turned slightly as if to check if anyone had noticed her. Leah testified next, confirming she had heard footsteps and smelled gasoline shortly before the fire. Each piece of testimony seemed to chip away at the mask Karen wore, though she sat rigid, eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance. Then came the video footage. It was grainy, but the outline was undeniable. Even from across the courtroom, I felt my pulse spike as the image of that visor appeared on the screen. Her attorney objected, claiming the video was inconclusive, but the judge allowed it to remain as evidence, noting that it matched the description given by multiple witnesses. When it was my turn to testify, I took a deep breath and stepped up to the stand. I spoke about the first day I met Karen, the notes in my mailbox, the fines, the driveway confrontations. I described the night of the fire in detail, the smell of smoke, the orange glow, the desperate scramble to escape. My voice cracked when I talked about standing on the curb, watching my home burn, knowing in my gut who had done it. The defense tried to paint me as a difficult neighbor, someone who had clashed with the HOA and exaggerated complaints out of spite. They suggested the fire could have been set by someone else with a grudge or even caused by faulty wiring. But each time they pushed, the prosecution countered with another fact, another piece of evidence that pointed straight back to Karen. When the closing arguments were made, the tension in the room was electric. My attorney's final words were simple: this wasn't about enforcing rules. This was about power, control, and revenge. And it ended with a house reduced to ashes. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, I could barely breathe. The foreman stood, holding the slip of paper. We find the defendant, Karen Williams, guilty on all counts. For a moment, the room was utterly still. Then the judge's gavel came down, and reality crashed over me. Karen's expression flickered, shock, anger, and something that looked almost like fear. She was led away in handcuffs, still muttering under her breath. I walked out of that courthouse into the crisp afternoon air feeling lighter than I had in months. My house was gone, my belongings lost, but in that moment, I had won something more important. I had my voice back. And Karen, for all her power games, had finally lost.